Hey everyone, welcome back to the Alberta Roundup. I'm your host, Rachel Emmanuel. On today's show, we are going to be taking a look at Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, who said she was forced to invoke the Alberta Sovereignty Act for the first time because the Alberta government is not making progress in its talks with the federal government. We're also going to be looking at an infamous lockdown advocate and Alberta NDP supporter who blamed Premier Smith for Canada's poor climate performance. Also on the show, Calgary Mayor Yodi Gondek refused to attend the annual menorah lighting at City Hall because she said it supported Israel. I'm also going to be responding to some of your comments from last week's episode. All that and more happening now on the Alberta Roundup. Up first, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith said she was forced to invoke the Alberta Sovereignty Act for the first time because the province is not making progress in its talks with the federal government. Premier Smith announced that she was invoking the act to, quote, create a shield to protect Albertans from Ottawa's dangerous and unconstitutional electricity regulations. In a recent interview with CTV Power Plays host Vashi Kapelos, Smith said Alberta needs to build more baseload power, but generators aren't willing to step up ahead of expected federal regulations that would enforce a net zero electricity grid by 2035. Smith said energy executives have told her that their board of directors won't allow them to take that risk over fear that someone will end up in jail for breaking federal law by failing to comply with the expected regulations. In response to that, Kapelos wondered why the Premier is invoking the act now when those regulations aren't expected until mid-next year and Ottawa hasn't ruled out a carve-out for Alberta. Take a listen to the Premier's response.
Oh, I can tell you that we're not making progress at the table. I mean, I told the Prime Minister from the very first day I spoke with him that we wanted to have a 2050 target. I asked him to wait for my emissions reduction and energy development plan to be released. He did. We asked them not to come forward with these gazetted regs, and if they did, to give a carve-out to Alberta, they refused. We've been having joint discussions every couple of weeks, and we're not seeing anywhere near the progress that we need. They're not aligning around our 2050 target. They're not accepting the reality of where we find ourselves in Alberta, and as a result, we have to take matters into our own hands. I know that in other jurisdictions, they've got a supply of hydroelectric power. Others have a supply of nuclear power. We don't have either of those. Our baseload power has always been on natural gas and is going to be for decades to come, which is why since the federal government doesn't seem to be prepared to recognize how essential that is, we have to take steps so that we can start getting some of those projects in the queue now.
Later in that conversation, Premier Smith was also accused of flouting the rule of law. But Danielle Smith said Ottawa is the one who is flouting the rule of law by bullying Alberta. Here's what that sounded like.
Oh, far from it. The federal government is flouting the rule of law. They have now lost 2 court cases, and they've lost them because they continue to overreach in our jurisdiction. Then they make us go to court for years at great expense while everything is frozen in the private sector to try to get our rights back. We're not going to do that. We can't afford to do that this time. I can't afford to wait 4 or 5 or 10 years for the Supreme Court to ultimately come down on our side, as I believe they will. The federal government has to stop acting in a lawless way. They have been given an admonishment twice that this is not what cooperative federalism looks like. They cannot use their jurisdiction to trample on ours. And we remain at the table. I think we can work with them on developing a framework for small modular nuclear. We can develop a framework around hydrogen. And I think we can develop a framework around carbon capture. But we are not going to be bullied into giving up our jurisdiction. They have no right to be dictating to us. And we would ask for them to continue to work cooperatively with us, because I think we can.
Moving on to our next story here. This one is from my colleague Cosmin Jurja. While speaking at the COP28 Climate Summit in Dubai, lockdown advocate and infamous NDP supporter Joel Vipond laid the blame for Canada's poor climate performance solely at the feet of Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. Speaking on the United Conservative Party government's decision to invoke the Sovereignty Act, Vipond claimed that Canada was failing to meet international commitments because of Alberta. Here's what that sounded like.
This is like 3 days ago, they said that they were going to do the Sovereignty Act to stop any kind of clean electricity regulations from being implemented. Clean electricity is how we get to net zero. If we don't have clean electricity, we don't get there. So yeah, myth, Alberta is a leader on climate. So let's be clear though, that Canada is not doing well because of Alberta. In fact, Alberta has had right now has 38% of all of our country's emissions. 38%. And it's increased 55% since 1990. So we're failing because of our province. So the reality is we need to phase out fossil fuels. We need to transition to renewable energy and energy efficiency. And Canada's not going to achieve any of its targets unless Alberta steps up to the plate and starts doing its job, taking responsibility for its past inactions and start doing what's right. So I told my daughters I'm going because I'm scared. I'm scared because this last summer sucked. It sucked because of fires. It sucked because of floods. We are in big trouble, and unless we do something, it's all going to burn.
I'm sure some of you remember that during the COVID-19 pandemic, Vipon was cited extensively by the legacy media for advocating for increased lockdown measures. He actively led protests against the Alberta government when it removed some restrictions, including a call for a general strike. Moreover, in August 2021, True North reported that despite Vipon's claim that he had no affiliation with the Alberta NDP, he was a stringent supporter for the party. Data from Elections Alberta show that a Joe Vipon from Calgary donated nearly $20,000 to the Alberta NDP over the last 7 years. Moving into what we're watching, on Monday, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith shot down any suggestions that a methane cap would be introduced in the province. That happened after Federal Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault announced new regulations at the COP28 conference in Dubai. The new regulations call for methane emissions to be reduced by 75% from 2012 levels by 2030. Premier Smith accused Ottawa of once again embarking on an unconstitutional, unrealistic, and costly path. In a joint statement with Alberta Environment Minister Rebecca Schultz, the duo said, quote, "The federal government has unilaterally established new methane emissions rules and targets to help win international headlines." Smith and Schultz also said the new regulations won't help anyone except Guilbeault's post-politics career. And while we're on the topic of COP28, just ahead of that conference, Premier Smith announced tax credits to incentivize carbon capture technology. Here's the Premier on CTV News explaining that decision.
Well, what I'd say is that we own the resource. Now, the Alberta government and Albertans own the resource, 85% of it. And we ask the energy companies to develop the resource on our behalf. And we get a lot of revenue as a result of it. I think this year in combination, our royalty revenue, as well as our revenue from corporate income tax, along with personal income tax, is somewhere in the order of $20 billion. And so if we can incentivize the construction of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, so we can have the best barrels and the greenest barrels and ensure that that revenue stream continues for the next 20, 30, 40 years or more, then it seems to me it's a pretty good investment.
Finally, moving into the controversy of the week, Calgary Mayor Yodi Gondek refused to attend the annual menorah lighting at Calgary City Hall, saying it became, quote, too political after organizers decided to use the event to show support for Israel. In a lengthy statement posted to X, formerly known as Twitter, the mayor wrote, quote, "When I was asked to speak weeks ago, it was to bring traditional greetings, celebrating Hanukkah and the spirit of Calgary's Jewish community. The last-minute change goes against the original intention and has left me feeling let down by leadership. I am saddened that this change makes it impossible for me to attend tomorrow's event, and I am incredibly concerned that people wishing to celebrate Hanukkah will have their good intentions compromised." Gondek went on to say that by becoming political, the event went against the mission to, quote, uphold diversity and inclusion. She added, quote, "Further, in the many conversations I have had with Jewish and Muslim leaders, the outcome has been agreement to engage in an interfaith manner, to move forward in peace and prayer. The changed nature of tomorrow's event creates a divide and forces people to choose a side. There are no sides to choose when terrorists incite violence by murdering innocent Israelis, knowing retaliation will follow and lead to the murder of innocent Palestinians. It is absolutely possible to condemn acts of violence and war without choosing one community over another. We have a moral imperative to do so. The killing must stop in Gaza because it is spreading division and hatred far and wide. Eradicating Hamas must come in a different form than mass casualties." The Calgary Sun spoke to a rabbi and organizer of the event who said the day's central meaning remains religious and spiritual. Rabbi Menachem Mutsaf said, quote, "It is a celebration of Hanukkah and bringing Hanukkah to life. We celebrate light over darkness and light over death. It's not a demonstration for Israel. but at the same time, of course, we're supporting Israel. In her decision not to attend the event, Gondek pointed to a poster advertising the ceremony, which said supporting Israel on it. It also included the popular Hebrew phrase, meaning the people of Israel live. Those of you who are watching on video can see that poster now. Comment under the video below, what do you think of Gondek's decision not to attend or speak at the ceremony? Okay guys, moving into our weekly comment roundup. I'm so glad to be doing this again. It's always one of my favorite parts of the show. User James D27KY said, quite ironic what the environment minister says about it being illegal, considering he's an ex-convict. He's of course referring to Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault's claims that the Alberta Sovereignty Act is illegal. And in response to this comment, I'm once again going to show you this excellent photo of Stephen Guilbeault in an orange jumpsuit. He looks a little bit like a madman in this photo. I just see those eyes. Those are crazy eyes right there. User Jamie Mays 6065 said, I only approve of photo radar in school zones, but nowhere else because outside of school zones would be fishing. God keep our land glorious and free. I would still like to see them banned altogether, but maybe I will feel a little bit differently when I have a child in school. I'll let you guys know in a couple years. And finally, YouTube Hates Us 2651 said, keep the camera that pegged Krista Freeland at 142 kilometers an hour the day she left her bike at home. This is my favorite comment of the week. Of course, these cameras are only useful should they be catching elected officials breaking the laws that they created. All right, everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. That's all I have for you today. As always, if you're able to support our work, you can do that over at donate.tnc.news. I will see you guys next week. Have a great weekend and God bless.